Hey everyone. This is a chapter from the book Pannekoek and the Workers' Councils by Serge Bricianer. See if I said that right.
Serge Bricianer.
Serge Bricianer. Alright. Yeah, so the book's titled Pannekoek and the Workers' Councils. I would like to read this book from start to finish. But unfortunately, I have a lot of other things that I'm also trying to read, and most of them are pertaining to dissident, radical left conceptions of the trajectory of the Russian Revolution and the society established therein. So, chapter 11 of this book is titled The Russian Revolution. So I'm reading this to get some access to some secondary source material regarding Pannekoek's commentary on the Russian Revolution. So, let me get to the page that the essay begins on. I believe I got this from Libcom, but I can't be certain. But it's definitely on Libcom. Come on, you son of a gun. Okay. Here we go. The Russian Revolution. Almost all of the, quote, organized, end quote, forces of council communism disappeared shortly after the inauguration of the Nazi reign of terror. There remained only isolated elements and small groups scattered throughout the world. Only one group, the Group van Internationale Communisten, or GIC, Group of International Communists, continued to display at that time any theoretical or practical activity. We shall discuss it later. For the moment, though, let us note that it published several pamphlets by Pannekoek, generally anonymously. Footnote. For instance, in the pamphlet De Arbeiders, Het Parlement in het Communismus, Pannekoek deals in broad outline with the idea of the councils. The table of contents provides a good summary of this pamphlet: crisis and misery, the conflict between work and property, the class struggles, parliamentarianism as an instrument of emancipation, leaders as emancipators, the utility of parliament, the Communist Party, the direct action of the masses, the workers' councils. End footnote. One of these GIC publications was Pannekoek's Lenin as Philosopher. To which we have already referred. The title is itself revealing, since the pamphlet, subtitled A Critical Examination of the Philosophical Basis of Leninism, is in effect a critique of Lenin's materialism and Empirio-criticism, published in 1908 and issued in German in 1927. Following Marx and Dietzgen, Pannekoek examined the objective character both of matter in the modern sense, including wave phenomenon, and of mental representations, from the simplest to the most complex, a mathematical model, for example, as well as the forms of interaction between the material world and the spiritual world. Pannekoek follows Marx, we have said, but this needs qualification. In effect, Pannekoek stresses that Marxism is a body of ideas that are by definition revolutionary, and that the politics of Marx, like his theories, developed in close connection with the organic transformation of society. Quote, the method of research that Marx and Engels framed remains up to this day an excellent guide and tool toward the understanding and interpretation of new events, end quote. This method is that of historical materialism, quote, a living theory that grows with the proletariat and with the tasks and aims of the proletariat's struggle, end quote. Pannekoek, footnote here. Oh, there's no footnote. Pannekoek applies this method to the study of the bourgeois ideas of the world, those whose development rests primarily on the idea of the natural sciences, quote, the spiritual basis of capitalism, end quote. These ideas, Pannekoek says, took on a materialist character as long as the bourgeoisie fought for political power against feudal absolutism and religion, the latter still being at that time the spiritual basis of the former. But when the bourgeoisie had come into power and the class struggle had emerged, the new dominant class stressed the weakness of materialism and the limits of science. And it is in this context, with Marx having, quote, stated that realities determine thought, that Dietzgen established the relationship between reality and thought, end quote. Dietzgen was to show, in effect, that spiritual and material phenomenon, quote, constitute the entire real world, a coherent entity in which matter determines mind, end quote. That is, thoughts are, quote, material for our brain activity of forming concepts, end quote, and mind, through human activity, determines matter. We are therefore dealing with what, quote, may rightly be called monism, end quote. A monism that Pannekoek was to take up on his own account, adapting it to the evolution of the exact sciences. Footnote. Pierre Neville finds in the Pannekoek pamphlet, which has, quote, some good chapters, end quote, a, quote, vague realism, end quote, then a, quote, dualism, end quote, and finally a, quote, existentialism, end quote. End footnote. Pannekoek therefore examines from this monist and materialist perspective the epistemological theories of Mach and Avenarius. We can deal here with only one aspect of this masterly account, which certainly deserves to be published in full. Mach, whose philosophical work made a considerable contribution to the development of quantitative physics, reduced the world to a system of objects, the knowledge of which was a matter of sensations of a predominantly intersubjective character. Not the interaction of, but the near identity of matter and mind. To this, Pannekoek answers, in line with Marxism, that knowledge does not originate in personal meditation, as Avenarius holds, or only in the activity of the professional philosopher alone, as Mach holds, but in social labor, in the interaction of man and nature in general. Continuing with a close analysis of this anti-Machist work by Lenin, Pannekoek shows that Lenin, who was in no way equipped to understand modern physics and therefore the ideas of the Austrian physicist, thoroughly misinterprets and misunderstands it, and by way of refutation can only indulge in invective. According to Lenin, quote, the philosophical expression of objective reality, end quote, covers only physical matter, whereas matter, quote, in historical materialism, bracket, is, end bracket, the designation of all that is really existing in the world, end quote. But, says Pannekoek, what must be specially noted is the identity relationship that Lenin establishes between Marx and Engels on the one hand and the bourgeois materialists on the other, with the exception of 3 points, namely the, quote, mechanistic materialism, end quote, of the bourgeois thinkers, quote, the anti-dialectical character of their philosophy, end quote, and the, quote, non-intelligibility of historical materialism, end quote. Lenin Materialism and Empirio-criticism. In this connection, Pannekoek points out, quote, of course, theoretical ideas must be criticized by theoretical arguments, but the social consequences are emphasized with such vehemence. The social origins of the contested ideas should not be left out of consideration. This most essential character of Marxism does not seem to exist for Lenin." End quote. Pannekoek, Lenin as philosopher. Lenin, in speaking of a book by Hegel, the materialist popularizer, says, quote, "This little book has become a weapon in the class struggle," end quote. But what class struggle does Lenin mean, and at what point, at what period, and under what conditions? Pannekoek comments as follows, quote, "Socialist workers embrace the social doctrines of Marx and the materialism of natural science with equal interest. Socialist workers labor under capitalism. Their daily experience and their awakening understanding of social forces contributed greatly toward undermining traditional religion. Then, to solve their doubts, the need for scientific knowledge grew, and the workers became the most zealous readers of the works of Buchner and Hegel. ... This, by the way, concurs with the fact that the working class movement had not yet reached beyond capitalism, that in practice the class struggle only tended to secure its place within capitalist society, and that the democratic solutions of the early bourgeois movements were also accepted as valid for the working class. The full comprehension of revolutionary Marxist theory is possible only in connection with revolutionary practice." End quote. Lenin as philosopher. Or Pannekoek, Lenin as philosopher. Quote, "Wherein do bourgeois materialism and historical materialism stand opposed to one another?" Quote, "Both agree insofar as they are materialist philosophies, that is, both recognize the primacy of the experienced material world, both recognize that spiritual phenomena, sensation, consciousness, ideas are derived from the former. They are opposite in that bourgeois materialism bases itself upon natural science, whereas historical materialism is primarily the science of society. Bourgeois scientists observe man only as an object of nature, the highest of the animals determined by natural laws. For an explanation of man's life and action, they have only general biological laws and, in a wider sense, the laws of chemistry, physics, and mechanics. With these means, little can be accomplished in the way of understanding social phenomena and ideas. Historical materialism, on the other hand, lays bare the specific evolutionary laws of human society and shows the interconnection between ideas and society." Quote, "The axiom of materialism," sorry, this is all like an extended quote, so it's still the same quote, but I'm just pulling you in that it's still the same quote. "The axiom of materialism that the spiritual is determined by the material world has therefore entirely different meanings for the two doctrines. For bourgeois materialism, it means that ideas or products of the brain are to be explained out of the structure and changes of the brain's substance, finally out of the dynamics of the atoms of the brain. For historical materialism, it means that the ideas of man are determined by his social conditions. Society is his environment, which acts upon him through his sense organs. This postulates an entirely different kind of problem, a different approach, a different line of thought, hence also a different theory of knowledge." Quote, "For bourgeois materialism, the problem of the meaning of knowledge is a question of the relationship of a spiritual phenomenon to the physico-chemical biological phenomenon of the brain matter. For historical materialism, the problem of the meaning of knowledge is a question of the relationship of our thoughts to the phenomenon that we experience as the external world. Now man's position in society is not simply that of an observing being. Man's position in society, man is a dynamic force who reacts upon his environment and changes his environment," end quote. In it is precisely this attitude of bourgeois materialism that Pannekoek traces in Lenin and in his teacher Plekhanov, after having shown its connection with conditions that made possible the emergence of classical social democracy. When Plekhanov identified the ideas of Marx as an extension of those of Feuerbach, Plekhanov was, in a certain sense, uttering a simple truism. But he also highlights the basic and distinctive trait of the Marxist theory of knowledge, which, quote, proceeds from the action of society, this self-made material world of man, upon the mind, and so belongs to the proletarian class struggle, end quote. Pannekoek, Leninist philosopher. It is on this basis that Pannekoek wrote the chapter, The Russian Revolution, which follows. Quote, the basic philosophical agreement of Lenin and Plekhanov and their common divergence from Marxism points to their common origin in Russian social conditions. The name and garb of doctrine or theory depends on its spiritual descent. They indicate the earlier thinker to whom we feel most indebted and whom we think we follow. The real content, however, depends on its material origin and is determined by the social conditions under which it developed and has to work. Marxism itself says that the main social ideas and spiritual trends express the aims of the classes, i.e., the needs of social development, and change with the class struggles themselves, so they cannot be understood isolated from society and class struggle. This holds for Marxism itself. Quote, in their early days, Marx and Engels stood in the first ranks of the opposition to German absolutism, an opposition that was still unified, containing both the bourgeoisie and the working class. Marx and Engels' development towards historical materialism, then, was the theoretical reflection of the development of the working class toward independent action against the bourgeoisie. The practical class antagonism found its expression in the theoretical antagonism. The fight of the bourgeoisie against feudalism was expressed by middle-class materialism, the cognate of Feuerbach's doctrine, which used natural science to fight religion as the consecration of the old powers. The working class in its own fight has little use for natural science. The instrument of its foe, its theoretical weapon, is social science, the science of social development. To fight religion by means of natural science has no significance for the workers. They know, moreover, that its roots will be cut off anyhow, first by capitalist development, then by their own class struggle. Nor have they any use for the obvious fact that thoughts are produced by the brain. The workers have to understand how ideas are produced by society. This is the content of Marxism, as Marxism grows among the workers as a living and stirring power, as the theory expressing the the workers' growing power of organization and knowledge. When in the second half of the 19th century capitalism gained complete mastery in Western and Central Europe as well as in America, bourgeois materialism disappeared. Marxism was the only materialist class view remaining. Quote, still continuing this quote, in Russia, however, matters were different. The fight against Tsarism was analogous to the former fight against absolutism in Europe. In Russia, too, church and religion were the strongest supports of the system of government. Church and religion held the rural masses engaged in primitive agrarian production in complete ignorance and superstition. The struggle against religion was here a prime social necessity. Since in Russia there was no significant bourgeoisie that could take up the fight as a future ruling class, the task fell to the intelligentsia. During scores of years, it waged a strenuous fight for enlightenment of the masses against Tsarism. Among the Western bourgeoisie, now reactionary and anti-materialistic, could find no support whatever in this struggle. It had to appeal to the socialist workers, who alone sympathized with it, and it took over their acknowledged theory, Marxism. Thus it came about that even intellectuals who were spokesmen of the first rudiments of a Russian bourgeoisie, such as Peter Struve and Tugan Baranovsky, presented themselves as Marxist. They had nothing in common with the proletarian Marxism of the West. What they learned from Marx was the doctrine of social development with capitalism as the next phase. A revolutionary force emerged in Russia for the first time when the workers took up the fight, first by strikes alone, then in combination with political demands. Now the intellectuals found a revolutionary class to join up with in order to become its spokesman in the Socialist Party. Quote, thus the proletarian class struggle in Russia was at the same time a struggle against czarist absolutism under the banner of socialism. So Marxism in Russia, developing as the theory of those engaged in the social conflict, necessarily assumed a different character than Marxism had in Western Europe. It was still the theory of a fighting working class, but this class had to first fight first and foremost for what in Western Europe had been the function and work of the bourgeoisie with the help of the intellectuals. So the Russian intellectuals, in adapting the theory to this local task, had to find a form of Marxism in which criticism of religion stood in the forefront. They found it in an approach to earlier forms of materialism and in the first writings of Marx from the time when in Germany the fight of the bourgeoisie and the workers against absolutism was still undivided. End quote. Footnote. That's from Pannekoek, Lenin as Philosopher. And it says, the footnote says, an expert Sovietologist, the Dominican priest Bachensky, citing this passage, approves of its content insofar as it pertains to the importance attached to the struggle against religion by the Russian revolutionaries. But Bachensky reproaches Pannekoek on the one hand for not seeing Lenin in a, quote, classic, end quote, materialist, rarely, quote, original, end quote, but, quote, rather less crude than Engels, end quote, and on the other for confining to, quote, religious values, end quote, only the hate that Lenin had for all, quote, values, end quote. Finally, Bachensky says, Pannekoek focuses too much on the conditions that determine the personality of Lenin and not sufficiently on this personality itself. That's from Bachensky, der Sowjetrussische Dialectischer Materialism, published in 1950. Thus Pannekoek too, quote, existentialist, end quote, for Neville, is not sufficiently existentialist for the priest Bachensky, end footnote. Plekhanov, Pannekoek recalls, was the first to adopt this approach and to establish a close relationship between the materialism of Marx and the theories of both French materialist and of Feuerbach. In the ranks of German socialism, quote, Plekhanov was known as the herald of the Russian working class struggle, which Plekhanov predicted theoretically at a time when practically there was hardly any trace, end quote. Nearer as he was to the Western socialists, Plekhanov, quote, was determined by Russian conditions less than was Lenin, end quote. Above all else, Pannekoek writes, Lenin and the Bolshevik Party saw as the first task, quote, the annihilation of Tsarism and of the backward, barbarous social system of Russia. Church and religion were the theoretical foundations of that system, end quote, since the need for, quote, a relentless fight against them, end quote. Quote, the struggle against religion stood in the center of Lenin's theoretical thought. Any concession, however small, to, quote, fideism, or fideism, I'm not sure how you say that. What is fideism again? I read Leninist philosopher one time, so I must have read this word before, but fideism. It's pronounced fideism, okay, and it means the doctrine that knowledge depends on faith or revelation. Okay, where was I? Quote, the struggle against religion stood in the center of Lenin's theoretical thought. Any concession, however small, to fideism was an attack on the life nerve of the movement, end quote. This fight, quote, was very similar to the former fight of the bourgeoisie and intellectuals in Western Europe, ... In Russia, however, it was the working class that had to wage the fight, so the fighting organization had to be a socialist party, proclaiming Marxism as its creed, and taking from Marxism what was necessary for the Russian Revolution, the doctrine of social development from capitalism to socialism, and the doctrine of class war as its moving force. Hence, Lenin gave to his materialism the name and garb of Marxism and assumed it to be the real Marxism. This identification was supported by still another circumstance. In Russia, capitalism had not grown up gradually from small-scale production in the hands of a middle class, as capitalism had in Western Europe. Big industry was imported from outside as a foreign element by Western capitalism, exploiting the Russian workers. Moreover, Western financial capital, by its loans to the Tsar, exploited the entire agrarian Russian people who were heavily taxed to pay the interest. Western capital here assumed the character of colonial capital, with the Tsar and his officials as its agents. In countries exploited as colonies, all the classes have a common interest in throwing the yoke of the usurious foreign capital to establish their own free economic development, leading as a rule to home capitalism. This fight is waged against world capital, hence often under the name of socialism, and the workers of the Western countries who stand against the same foe are the natural allies. Thus, in China, Sun Yat-sen was a socialist, since, however, the Chinese bourgeoisie, for whom he was a spokesman, was a large and powerful class, his socialism was, quote, national, end quote, and Sun Yat-sen opposed the, quote, errors, end quote, of Marxism. Lenin, on the contrary, had to rely on the working class, and because his fight had to be implacable and radical, Lenin espoused the radical ideology of the Western proletariat fighting world capitalism, Marxism in other words. Since, however, the Russian Revolution showed a mixture of two characters, bourgeois revolution in its immediate aims, proletarian revolution in its active forces, the appropriate Bolshevist theory likewise had to present two characters, bourgeois materialism in its basic philosophy, proletarian evolutionism in its doctrine of class struggle. The mixture was termed Marxism, but it is clear that Lenin's Marxism, as determined by the special Russian attitude toward capitalism, had to be fundamentally different from the real Marxism growing as the basic view of the worker in the countries of big capital. Marxism in Western Europe is the worldview of a working class confronting the task of converting a most highly developed capitalism, its own world of life and action, into communism. The Russian workers and intellectuals could not make this their object. They had first to open the way for a free development of a modern industrial society. In the Russian Marxists, to the Russian Marxists, the nucleus of Marxism is not contained in Marx's thesis that social reality determines consciousness, but in the sentence of young Marx inscribing in big letters in the Moscow People's House that religion is the opium of the people. It may happen that in a theoretical work there appear not... This is still Pannekoek speaking, by the way. It may happen that in a theoretical work there appear not the immediate surroundings and tasks of the author, but more general and remote influences and wider tasks. In Lenin's book, however, nothing of the sort is perceptible. It is a manifestation and exclusive reflection of the Russian Revolution at which he was aiming. Its character so entirely corresponds to bourgeois materialism that, had it been known at the time in Western Europe, only confused rumors on the internal strifes of Russian socialism penetrated in Western Europe, and had it been properly interpreted, one could have predicted that the Russian Revolution must somehow result in a kind of capitalism based on a workers' struggle. There is a widespread opinion that the Bolshevik Party was Marxist and that it was only for practical reasons that Lenin, the great scholar and leader of Marxism, gave to the revolution a direction other than what Western workers called communism, thereby showing his realistic Marxian insight. The critical opposition to the Russian and Communist Party politics tries indeed to oppose the despotic practice of the present Russian government, termed Stalinism, to the, quote, true, end quote, Marxist principles of Lenin and old Bolshevism. I'm assuming he's referencing Trotskyism. Wrongly so. Not only because in practice these politics were inaugurated already by Lenin, but also because the alleged Marxism of Lenin and the Bolshevist Party is nothing but a legend. Lenin never knew real Marxism. Whence should Lenin have taken it? Capitalism he knew only as colonial capitalism. Social revolution he knew only as the annihilation of big land ownership and czarist despotism. Russian Bolshevism cannot be reproached for having abandoned the way of Marxism, for Russian Bolshevism was never on that way. Every page of Lenin's philosophical work is there to prove it, and Marxism itself, by its thesis that theoretical opinions are determined by social relations and necessities, makes it clear that it could not be otherwise. Marxism, however, at the same time shows the necessity of the legend. Every bourgeois revolution requiring working class and peasant support needs the illusion that it is something different, larger, more universal. Here it was the illusion that the Russian Revolution was the first step of world revolution, liberating the entire proletarian class from capitalism. Its theoretical expression was the legend of Marxism. Of course, this is still Pannekoek. Of course, Lenin was a pupil of Marx. From Marx he learned what was most essential for the Russian Revolution, the uncompromising proletarian class struggle. Just as for similar reasons, the Social Democrats were pupils of Marx. And surely the fight of the Russian workers in their mass actions and their Soviets was the most important practical example of modern proletarian warfare. That, however, Lenin did not understand Marxism as the theory of proletarian revolution, and he did not understand capitalism, bourgeoisie, proletariat in their highest modern development, was shown strikingly when, from Russia, by means of the Third International, the world revolution was to be begun, and the advice and warnings of Western Marxists was entirely disregarded. Maybe he might be speaking here, but in reference to Hermann Gorder's open letter to Comrade Lenin. An unbroken series of blunders, failures, and defeats that resulted in the present weakness of the workers' movement showed the unavoidable shortcomings of the Russian leadership. End quote. Pannekoek. Thus, Pannekoek links Russian conditions to Lenin's fragmentary development of Marxism. But according to Pannekoek, Lenin regarded ideas as truths having an existence independent of society, without seeing in them, quote, generalizations of former experiences and necessities, end quote. He thus assigns to them, quote, an unlimited validity, end quote, and under the guise of restoring Marxism in view of idealist tendencies, he hardens them into the dogmas of bourgeois materialism, divinized abstractions, matter, energy, and causality in nature, freedom and progress in social life, replaced in our day by the cult of, quote, the state and of the nation, end quote. Sorry, one second. The sphere of influence of Leninism is not limited to Russia, Pannekoek wrote in 1938. Quote, the aim of the Communist Party, footnote, references, of course, to the Communist Party in the generic sense, which is called world revolution. Quote, the aim of the quote, the aim of the Communist Party, which is called world revolution, is to bring to power by means of the fighting force of the workers a stratum of leaders who institute planned production by means of state power. In its essence, it coincides with the aims of social democracy. The social ideals of well-ordered organization of production for use under the direction of technical and scientific experts inspired, quote, daring radicalism of materialist thought. Thus, the Communist Party sees in this class a natural ally and seeks to draw it into its camp. By means of a suitable propaganda, the Communist Party tries therefore to withdraw the intelligentsia from the spiritual influences of the bourgeoisie and of private capitalism in decline, and to win the intelligentsia over to a revolution destined to give the intelligentsia their true place as a new dominant class. At the philosophical level, this means winning the intelligentsia over to materialism. A revolution is incompatible with the soft-centered and conciliatory ideology of an idealist system. It needs the exciting and audacious radicalism of materialism. This is still Pannekoek speaking. There is, of course, the difficulty that the intellectual class is too limited in number, too heterogeneous in social position, and hence too feeble to be able to single-handedly to seriously threaten capitalist domination. Neither are the leaders of the Second and the Third Internationals a match for the power of the bourgeoisie, even if the Second and Third Internationals could impose themselves by strong and clear politics instead of being rotten through opportunism. When, however, capitalism is tumbling into a heavy economic or political crisis that rouses the masses, when the working class has taken up the fight and succeeds in shattering capitalism in an initial victory, then their time will come. Then they will intervene and slide themselves in as leaders of the revolution, nominally to give their aid by taking part in the fight, in reality to deflect the action in the direction of their party aims. Whether or not the defeated bourgeoisie will then rally with them to save what can be saved of capitalism, their intervention in any case comes down to cheating the workers, leading the workers off the road to freedom. End quote. Pannekoek. Footnote. Karl Kautsky, in a laudatory account of Pannekoek's work, clarifies the, quote, sliding, end quote, of historical materialism into dialectical materialism under the aegis of Lenin, who fitted the Hegelian dialectic to the old bourgeois materialism and pointed out the close link existing between the latter and the Jacobin political form, state party dictatorship of Russian and international Bolshevism. That's from Kautsky's Lenin's Philosophy, published in Living Marxism, which I believe was the project published in Living Marxism, Volume 4, Issue 5, in November 1938. I believe that was the paper of Paul Maddock. It says, also Musso and Philippe, Politique et philosophie de Lénine à Harper, Internationalism, 30th issue, volume 30, January 1948. Both Musso and Philippe reproach Pannekoek for seeing the October Revolution as a purely bourgeois movement and for reducing the whole works of Lenin to a philosophical expose of, quote, more than doubtful quality, end quote, and consequently neglecting the, quote, political positions, end quote, of the Bolsheviks, the most advanced positions of that time, we are told. End footnote. I'm finding this essay really interesting. I might have to read this whole book. I was just thinking, it'll probably be boring and suck. I thought it was going to be boring, but I'm following along, so hopefully you are too. In his major work, Workers' Councils, footnotes over. Back to the text. In Pannekoek's major work, Workers' Councils, Pannekoek deals with the Russian Revolution as follows. Quote, the Russian Revolution was an important episode in the development of the working class movement. First, as already mentioned, by the display of new forms of political strike, instruments of revolution. Moreover, in a higher degree, by the first appearance of new forms of self-organization of the fighting workers known as Soviets, i.e. councils. In 1905, they were hardly noticed as a special phenomenon and then disappeared with the revolutionary activity itself. In 1917, the councils reappeared with greater power, and now their importance was grasped by the workers of Western Europe, and they played a role here in the class struggles after World War I. Quote, the Soviets, this is still Pannekoek speaking. I don't know why I said quote, it's the same text, but it's a new paragraph. Still a Pannekoek quote. There's a lot of very long block quotes in this text. The Soviets essentially were simply the strike committees such as always arise in wide strikes. Since the strikes in Russia broke out in large factories and rapidly expanded over towns and districts, the workers had to keep in continual touch. In the shops, the workers assembled and talked regularly after the close of work, or in times of tension even continually. The entire day, they sent their delegates to other factories and to the central committees where information was interchanged, difficulties discussed, decisions taken, and new tasks considered. But here the task proved more encompassing than in ordinary strikes. The workers had to throw off the heavy oppression of Tsarism. The workers felt that their action was changing Russian society at its foundations. The workers had to consider not only wages and labor conditions in their shops, but all questions related to society at large. They had to find their own way in these realms and to take decisions on political matters. When the strike flared up, extended over the entire country, stopped all industry and traffic, and paralyzed governmental functions, the Soviets were confronted with new problems. They had to regulate public life. They had to take care of public security and order. They had to provide the indispensable public utilities and services. They had to perform governmental functions. What they decided was executed by the workers, whereas the government and police stood aloof, conscious of their impotence against the rebellious masses. Then the delegates of other groups, of intellectuals, of peasants, of soldiers who came to join the Central Soviets took part in the discussion and decisions. But all this power was like a flash of lightning, like a passing meteor. When at last the Tsarist government mustered its military forces and beat down the movement, the Soviets disappeared. Thus it was in 1905. In 1917, the war had weakened government through the defeats of the front and the hunger in the towns, and now the soldiers, mostly peasants, took part in the action. Besides the workers' councils in the towns, soldiers' councils were formed in the army. The officers were shot when they did not acquiesce to the Soviets taking all power into their hands to prevent entire anarchy. After half a year of vain attempts on the part of politicians and military commanders to impose new governments, the Soviets, supported by the socialist parties, were master of society. Now the Soviets stood before a new task. From organs of revolution, they had to become organs of reconstruction. The masses were their own master and, of course, began to build up production according to their needs and life interest. What the masses wanted and did was not determined, as always in such cases, by inculcated doctrine, but by their own class character, by their conditions of life. What were these conditions? Russia was a primitive agrarian country with only the beginnings of industrial development. The masses of the people were uncivilized and ignorant peasants, spiritually dominated by a gold-glittering church, and even the industrial workers were strongly connected with their old villages. The village Soviets arising everywhere were self-governing peasant committees. The village Soviets seized the large estates of the former landowners and divided them up. The development went in the direction of smallholders with private property and displayed already the distinctions between larger and smaller proprietors, between influential, wealthy, and more humble poor farmers. In the towns, on the other hand, there could be no development to private capitalist industry because there was no bourgeoisie of any significance. The workers wanted some form of socialist production, the only one possible under these conditions, but their minds and character, only superficially touched by the beginnings of capitalism, were hardly adequate to the task of themselves regulating production. So their foremost and leading elements, the socialists of the Bolshevik Party, organized and hardened by years of devoted fight, their leaders in the revolution, became the leaders in the reconstruction. Moreover, were these working-class tendencies not to be drowned by the flood of aspirations for private property coming from the land, a strong central government had to be formed, able to restrain the peasants' tendencies. In this heavy task of organizing industry, of organizing the defensive war against counter-revolutionary attacks, of subduing the resistance of capitalist tendencies among the peasants, and of educating peasants to modern scientific ideas instead of their old beliefs, all the capable elements among the workers and intellectuals, supplemented by such of the former officials and officers as were willing to cooperate, had to combine in the Bolshevist Party as the leading body. It formed the new government. The Soviets gradually were eliminated as organs of self-rule and reduced to subordinate organs of the government apparatus. The name of the Soviet Republic, however, was preserved as a camouflage, and the ruling party retained the name of Communist Party, end quote. Pannekoek, Workers' Councils. Pannekoek then goes on to describe the manner in which a system of state capitalist production developed in Russia, but we cannot do more than mention it here. Damn it. His account concludes that with the following, which is highly characteristic of his method, quote, "For the working class, the significance of the Russian Revolution must be looked for in quite different directions. Russia showed to the European and American workers confined within reformist ideas and practice, first how an industrial working class by a gigantic mass action of wild strikes is able to undermine and destroy an obsolete state power. And second, how in such actions the strike committees develop into workers' councils, organs of fight and of self-management, acquiring political tasks and functions," end quote. Pannekoek, Workers' Councils, excuse me. It is on the same basis that in Leninist Philosopher, Pannekoek defines what he means by revolutionary Marxism. Here again, Pannekoek is not at all concerned with restoring a body of ideas, still less with polemics, but he reasons in accordance with the real conditions and the final purpose of an all-out working-class struggle in the developed capitalist countries. Quote, "In reality, for the working class in the countries of developed capitalism in Western Europe and America, matters are entirely different. Its task is not the overthrow of a backward absolutist monarchy. Its task is to vanquish a ruling class commanding the mightiest material and spiritual forces the world ever knew. Its object cannot be to replace the domination of stockbrokers and monopolists over a disorderly production by the domination of state officials over a production regulated from above. Its object is to be itself master of production and itself to regulate labor, the basis of life. Only then is capitalism really destroyed. Such an aim cannot be attained by an ignorant mass, the confident disciples of a party that presents itself as expert leadership. It can be attained only if the workers themselves, the entire class, understand the conditions, ways, and means of their fight, when every man knows from his judgment what to do." There's the title of Philippe Bournet's book, I believe that's how you say his name, is titled something like but the subtitle is something like Against Trotsky and Lenin and Stalin, the workers must think for themselves. As opposed to a lot of people now who, this is just me talking, there's a lot of people now when they think of like, when people are induced to think for themselves, sometimes people think that means like just total freedom to think whatever you want. But when reason is what is orienting the thought of yourself, people come to universalistic conclusions, not just self-serving, animalistic, hoarding. What's the word? Not the word. Basically, thinking for yourself does not necessarily entail religious or conspiratorial just nonsense. It entails using one's own reasoning capacities to come to universalizable concepts. But I think that's the Kantian idea of how morality would work and how enlightenment works. It seems like Pannekoek's talking about some kind of like, well, he is talking about like a working class self-enlightenment. Based on their own collective inner resources. But I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. I'm just going to reread from where I think I was. It's getting late into the evening, and I'm kind of feel like I'm rambling in a delirious manner, but, hopefully it's still listenable. Only then is capitalism really destroyed. Such an aim cannot be attained by an ignorant mass, the confident disciples of a party that presents itself as expert leadership. It can be attained only if the workers themselves, the entire class, understand the conditions, ways, and means of their fight, when every man knows from his own judgment what to do. They must, every one of them, act themselves, decide themselves, hence think out and know for themselves. Only in this way will a real class organization be built up from below, having the form of something like workers' councils. It is of no avail that they have been convinced that their leaders know what is afoot and have gained the point in theoretical discussion, an easy thing when each is acquainted with the writings of his own party only. Out of the contest of arguments, they have to form a clear opinion themselves. There is no truth lying ready at hand that has only to be imbibed. In every new case, truth must be contributed by exertion of one's own brain. This does not mean, of course, that every worker should judge on scientific arguments in fields that can be mastered only by professional study. It means first that all workers should give attention not only to their direct working and living conditions, but also to the great social issues connected with their class struggle and the organization of labor, and would know how to take decisions here. And should know how to take decisions here. Sorry, it's a typo. It says WHOULD, and I thought it would be would, but it actually makes sense to say it's probably meant should. And should know how to take decisions here. But it implies, secondly, a certain standard of argument in propaganda and political strife. When the views of the opponent are distorted because the willingness or the capacity to understand them is lacking, then in the eyes of the believing adherents you may score success. But the only result which in party strife is even intended is to bind them with stronger fanaticism to the party. For the workers, however, what is of importance is not the increase of party power, but the increase of their own capacity to seize power and to establish their mastery over society. Only when, in arguing and discussing, the opponent is given his full pound, when in weighing arguments against one another each solid opinion is understood out of social class relations, will the participant hearers gain such well-founded insight as is necessary for a working class to assure its freedom. The working class needs Marxism for its liberation. Just as the results of the natural sciences are necessary for the technical construction of capitalism, so the results of social science are necessary for the organizational construction of communism. What was needed first was political economy, that part of Marxism that expounds the structure of capitalism, the nature of exploitation, the class antagonism, the tendencies of economic development. Political economy gave directly a solid base to the spontaneously arising fight of the workers against the capitalist masters. Then, in the further struggle, by its theory of the development of society from primitive economy through capitalism to communism, it gave confidence and enthusiasm through the prospect of victory and freedom. When the not yet numerous workers took up their first difficult fight, and the hopeless indifferent masses had to be roused, this insight was the first thing needed. When the working class is grown more numerous, more powerful, and society is full of the proletarian class struggle, another part of Marxism has to come to the forefront. That they should know that they are exploited and have to fight is not the main point anymore. They must know how to fight, how to overcome their weakness, how to build up their unity and strength. Their economic position is so easy to understand, their exploitation so manifest, that their unity and struggle, their common will to seize power over production, should presumably result at once. What hampers them is chiefly the power of the inherited and infused ideas, the formidable spiritual power of the middle class world, enveloping their minds into a thick cloud of beliefs and ideologies, dividing them and making them uncertain and confused. The process of enlightenment, of clearing up and vanquishing this world of old ideas and ideologies, is the essential process of building the working class power, is the progress of revolution. Here that part of Marxism is needed that we call its philosophy, the relation of ideas to reality, end quote. Pannekoek, Lenin as philosopher. Pannekoek applied to anarchism this evolutionary conception of Marxism linked with the new character of the class struggle. In earlier sections of the present collection, we have seen that he reproached anarchism for slowing down events. After World War II, he returned to this, but this time he ascribed a different motivation to it. This is shown by a letter to the Australian publisher of Workers' Councils. Sorry, I have a couple footnotes to read here. Footnote. Although the answer to Musam says something specific, its author is clearly against the idea of common action with the anarchists. A year later, when a section of the Communist Workers' Party of Germany proposed to create a new anti-Moscow international, it was Gorder who drew up its manifesto. Die Kommunistische Arbeiterinternationale, Berlin, 1921. The attempt had little impact except in Holland, of course, and in Bulgaria, where a Communist Workers' Party of 1,000 members was set up after the sabotage by the Leninist Communist Party of a railway workers' strike in 1919 to 1920. See Joseph Rothschild, The Communist Party of Bulgaria, published 1959. Next footnote. Pannekoek. Anarchism is not suitable. Southern Advocate for Workers' Councils. The title is J.A. Dawson's, J.A. Dawson being an Australian council communist. The title is J.A. Dawson's editor of the paper, who also published studies by other council communists such as Paul Maddock and Karl Kautsky, and by nonconformist anarchists such as Lane Dietz, translator of Lenin as philosopher into Spanish, and Kennefic. End footnote. All right, now this is a quote, and the quote is from the letter to the Australian publisher of Workers' Councils, J.A. Dawson. In the present times of increasing submission by the workers to powerful state tyranny, it is natural that more sympathy is directed toward anarchism with its propaganda of freedom, just as social democracy, anarchism's opponents, it has its roots in 19th century capitalism. One took its necessity from exploitation and capitalist competition, the other from the entire slaving and suppression of personality. One found its force in the need for and propaganda of organization, the other in the need for and propaganda of freedom. Since the former, social democracy, was felt most immediately and overwhelmingly by the workers, social democracy won the masses, and anarchism could not compete with. Social democracy. Now, under rising state capitalism, it seems to have a better chance. Anarchism does. But we have to bear in mind that both in the same way carry the mark of their origin out of the primitive conditions of the 19th century. The principle of freedom originating from bourgeois conditions of early capitalism, freedom of trade and enterprise, is not adequate to the working class. The problem or goals for the workers are to combine freedom and organization. That's here's the thing. Sorry, this is just an interruption for me. But when people talk about anarchism, just full capital A anarchism in abstraction from any of the internal differentiations within anarchism, their arguments are most likely going to be clumsy, and I don't know what Pannekoek is going to say about anarchism, but it probably will be clumsy. Especially, this is just my opinion, but if you think that that anarchists, in some sense, especially the anarchist communists that were represented by people, say, like Kropotkin or Malatesta, are anti-organizationalist, or don't think that um, organization and institutions of some kind are necessary in order to facilitate the realization of a form of non-market socialism. They're arguing a strong man, and it betrays an ignorance about the movement itself. I don't know if Pannekoek is going to go in this direction and what he's about to say, but I really highly encourage you to, if you're curious about this topic, um, about the differences in anarchism, I really recommend you check out the work of the anarchist communist historian Nick Heath, who publishes a lot of biographies on Libcom about people within the anarchist movement. He wrote a book called The Idea, which is a history of anarchist communism, which hopefully will get a larger readership than as time goes on, because it really differentiates anarchist communism as a distinct tradition from either anarcho-syndicalism or anarchist collectivism as represented by Bakunin. Obviously, all these people are important intellectual, these are people that anarchist communists read and draw on, but anarchist communism as a specific brand of anarchism that emerges in the 1870s and 1880s, when Bakunin's collectivism, which is kind of like comparable to Marx's lower stage of communist society based on distribution according to work, is abandoned in favor of distribution according to social need. That anarchist communism becomes a distinct tradition and is not reducible to syndicalism. And I think that it behooves people who want to make comments about anarchism and understand anarchism. I'm by no means myself an expert on anarchism. to really check out that book and try to get a feel for that political tendencies history. I think it's really inspiring and has something to tell us today. And I think getting clear about the specificities of different tendencies is important. This is just a broad, I think this is also true of Trotskyism. I think you have to understand the different arguments within Trotskyism and not, and try to find out what are the necessary features of Trotskyism and then argue from that point, as opposed to assuming that maybe the more superficial features of particular Trotskyists and Trotsky in particular moments are necessary features of Trotskyism. Um, the idea that some kind of like absolutist individualism is like is a necessary feature of anarchism is a completely misguided. And yeah, the adoption. Anyway, sorry, I've been going on too long, but I encourage you um, to try to escape dogmatic thinking by understanding the heterogeneity that exists um, within larger concepts. So if you're going to talk about anarchism, you have to say what anarchists you're speaking of, um, what tendencies in anarchism you're speaking of. Are you speaking of, I don't know, Alfredo Bonanno's, insurrectionary anarchism? Are you speaking of some type of Tolstoyan pacifistic anarchism? Are you talking about anarcho-syndicalism? Are you talking about anarchist communism? And within that, who you're talking about. Because if we just say Marxism and try to say the necessary features of Marxism or what Joseph Stalin or Pol Pot have to say, we're not getting anywhere. We're talking out our asses when we're speaking about these subjects. So it's very important to get very, very specific. Obviously, if you want to make offhand generalization comments, getting specific is not going to behoove you. And obviously, people have to have ideas about everything, lots of different topics that they're not experts in. I have opinions about all kinds of shit I'm not an expert in. And it's necessary in order to orient yourself in the world to have at least cursory knowledge of specific things that you could not possibly have, uh, ab, you know, the knowledge of a professional. But yeah, but I encourage you, in order to be a sophisticated, nuanced thinker, um, I'm not your dad, but I would tell you that, get serious about the distinctions, Anyway, let's get back to the text. And this is Pannekoek speaking. The principle of freedom originating from bourgeois conditions of early capitalism, freedom of trade and enterprise, is not adequate to the working class. Problems or goals for the workers are the combined freedom and organization. Anarchism, by setting up freedom as its goal, forgets that the free society of workers can only exist by a strong feeling of community as the prominent character of the collaborating producers. I don't think anarchism forgets that at all. This new character coming forth as strong solidarity in the workers' fight already is the basis of organization without compulsion from above. The self-made organization by free collaborating workers is the basis at the same time of their personal freedom, i.e. of their feeling as free masters of their own work. Freedom as the chief content of anarchist teaching may awake strong sympathies now, but it is only a part, not even the basic part of the goal of the working class, which is expressed by self-rule, self-determination, by means of council organization. I don't think anarchist communists would disagree with that at all. It seems then that in the present times there is in anarchism a certain approach towards the idea of workers' councils, especially where it involves groups of workers, but the old pure anarchist doctrine is too narrow to be of value for the workers' class struggle now. End quote. Oh, shit, that's the end of the chapter. Yeah, just to continue on that train, of thought is that everything that I predicted, Pannekoek would say, to toot my own horn, is exactly what he did end up saying. And this idea that uh, anarchists are opposed to things like uh, what he said here, self-rule, self-determination by means of council organization, um, is not um, it's not correct. It's not. It's a misrepresentation of the ideas of anarchism. But if taking for granted, if the ideas of anarchism were what Pannekoek is describing, Pannekoek would be right to critique them as he does. Um, the idea of just, you know, atomized, self-serving individuals without any obligation to each other, to treat each other as ends in themselves, um, uh, or the idea that we can just have, we can step away from capitalism and just everybody be some kind of, I don't know, isolated self-entrepreneur or something like that. If that was what the content of anarchism was, um, um, that kind of, definitely bourgeois notion of freedom, which Pannekoek is rightly criticizing here, um, would definitely be in need of critique. But though that's not actually the case um, for social anarchism at all. But yeah, thanks for listening to me ramble. Maybe one day I'll contribute something novel to the world of theory or historical research, social science or otherwise. Um, I'm just kind of thinking on the cuff right now, and it's probably a bunch of gibberish. So thanks for listening to my gibberish while I'm reading this thing. You'd probably prefer to read this without my what's the fucking word to it? God, marginalia. Is that what you call it? Like the fucking writings on the side of the text. It's probably the uh, sonic equivalent of getting a book from the library and there's a bunch of fucking marks inside of it. So I thank you for bearing with me while I think out loud and try to come to grips with the contents of what I'm reading um, while I'm reading them. I appreciate it, and I'm sorry if it's extremely irritating, but hopefully it, stimulates you to think what I'm saying is wrong or right, and opens up some of the problems that are being discussed in the pieces I'm reading. So thank you.